Thank you very much, Rick Edwards. It's 3 minutes past 9. Gordon Smart in with the Nation's phone in today. I would love to hear from you. 85058 on text, 08085 909 693. We're talking about some scenes at the weekend which we really don't see very often. 532 people arrested. Quite interesting as well. Nearly half were over 60. The average age was 54. So it's a conversation about protesting today as well. What do you think? Were you there? Was it a peaceful protest, or was it the opposite? Was it just support of a terrorist organisation? Is it as simple as that? Free speech or hate speech? That is the question we're asking this morning. 08085 909 693. And a reminder, the text is 85058. I'd love to hear from you. The question is Palestine action. What next? Right, let's start. The Justice Minister, Alex Davies-Jones, has been speaking to the BBC and speaking at BBC Breakfast this morning. So I think it's important to hear what she had to say about this. Have a listen.
With regards to Palestine Action, they are a proscribed terrorist organisation and their actions have not been peaceful. They have violently carried out criminal damage to RAF aircraft. We have credible reports of them targeting Jewish-owned businesses here in the United Kingdom. And there are other reasons of which we can't disclose because of national security. But they are a proscribed terrorist organisation, and anyone showing support for that terrorist organisation will feel the full force of the law.
So some strong language there from the Justice Minister, Alex Davies-Jones, speaking to BBC Breakfast this morning. Let's speak to somebody who was there yesterday. Paddy Friend, spokesperson for Our Juries. I believe, Paddy, you were arrested on Saturday, is that correct?
Hi, Gordon. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I was. It was quite something, really. I waited a few hours in Parliament Square. It took the police a long time to arrest me. But, eventually they did, arrested me, took me around the corner to a holding facility, but then I was released on bail. So perhaps I'm, not a highly dangerous terrorist that the Home Secretary might want you to believe I am.
Paddy, were you holding a placard? Was that the reason you were arrested, or did they explain the reason and read you your rights in that sense?
So yeah, I was arrested under the Terrorism Act, which is obviously very serious. And I was arrested for holding a placard. And the placard said, "I oppose genocide. I support Palestine action." And that's exactly why I was there in Parliament Square on Saturday, because there has been a genocide ongoing for the last 2 years in Palestine. We heard the headlines a moment ago. 5 more reporters murdered by Israel. We have men, women, and children being shot as they queue for food. We have people starving to death, and Palestine Action took direct action to try and stop that genocide. They were taking action to take out the quadcopter drones, to destroy the tools of genocide that are killing the Palestinian people, and that's why they were proscribed. It's as simple as that, and I had to take a stand against that.
Yeah, and Paddy, Our Juries, you regularly put on protests, don't you? And how was that on Saturday? Was it a peaceful protest? Because there were, looking at the police report, there were a couple of incidents, but generally speaking, was it quite a peaceful day?
It was a very peaceful day, and there were, of everyone that was there holding signs was completely peaceful. Completely peaceful.
I was just looking at this police report here. It says 6 arrests for assaults on officers. Fortunately, none were seriously injured. 1 arrest for obstructing a constable in the execution of his or her duty. 2 for breaching Section 14 Public Order Act conditions. But again, as I said, Paddy, you're regularly part of protests, but your sense of it on Saturday was that it was peaceful and calm.
It was absolutely peaceful and calm. Absolutely.
And Paddy, what happened when you were arrested? And what was the process that you went through?
Well, yeah, it was honestly quite bizarre, Gordon. I have been arrested before for a Palestine protest, and that time it was, I was taken to the cells, held for a very long time. But this time it wasn't really like that at all. The police officer that arrested me seemed a bit bemused about the whole thing. Really, I'm not sure he could quite believe what he was being asked to do. Arresting someone under terrorism law for holding a cardboard sign. And I was taken, 2 minutes round the corner from Parliament Square. The police had set up sort of gazebos in the street, and my details were taken there, and then I was released a few hours later, and allowed to walk the streets again.
Paddy, does it worry you at all when you hear Justice Minister Alex Davies-Jones this morning adding a little bit more of an explanation to to Palestine Action. I think the words were, there are other reasons which we can't disclose because of national security. Does that concern you at all?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't concern me at all. I think first of all, if there are these serious reasons, why haven't they disclosed them yet? Would be the first thing I'd say. And that they sort of make these these insinuations of violence, insinuations of a threat, but really what Palestine Action did is they stopped the Israel arms industry from being able to operate in this country, and they embarrassed the government.
Yeah, Paddy, it is a criminal act, though, isn't it, to violently destroy property, which is what they did at the RAF air base. And again, you've given a justification for it, but it is a criminal offence, isn't it, in this country?
It might well be a criminal offence. I mean, that's going to be for the jury to decide in that trial, right? And we know in the past that juries have acquitted people, on the basis that, okay, I might have done criminal damage, but I did that criminal damage to stop a greater crime, like a genocide, like crimes against humanity. But even if it is criminal damage, even if a crime has been committed, it is simply not terrorism. And to label it terrorism, and I think most of your listeners will agree with me here, is quite frankly completely insulting to the victims of real terrorism. I remember 7/7 in this country. I remember the Manchester bombings. That's real terrorism. That's what we thought was real terrorism. Violence against a civilian population, like what we're seeing in Gaza. That's real terrorism. People being shot as they queue for food. But are we seriously now talking about criminal damage, paint on a plane, as terrorism?
Okay, well, let's, Paddy, just stay there for a second, because I'm going to bring in Rod in Penzance now. Rod, what are your thoughts on this morning?
Everyone has a democratic right to agree or disagree with any organisation. But we've got a government, I use that term, which is part of my face, who've been democratically elected. The law has been passed. I'm more concerned about clogging up the courts, the money it takes to police these demonstrations, and rather than arresting people, and they should be under. You divide how much it costs. It costs 50 quid, and there's 50 demonstrations. Fine them all £1 each, and on your way. And every time you demonstrate, and it costs a lot of money, then you just pay a fine, rather than clog the courts up when there's far more important things to be doing. People have a right to demonstrate, but unfortunately, there's a democratically elected government who said this is illegal, and I think you have to pay the consequences. There's lots of things I disagree with this government, and on this occasion, I think that they shouldn't be demonstrating, or if they do, then they have to pay the consequence like everyone else does in life.
Paddy, what would you say? Paddy, let's bring Paddy back in there, Rod. Paddy, what would you say to Rod?
Well, Rod, I mean, first of all, I completely agree. We shouldn't be clogging up the courts, and our intention is not to clog up the courts. We're not trying to overwhelm the police.
I hope it doesn't. I do have sympathy with what you're, with your thoughts. Put it that way.
Exactly, and the police had a decision on Saturday. It was up to them whether they wanted to arrest us all. They could have left us be. They could have said, we're going to uphold basic democracy. We're going to uphold the Human Rights Act. And it was their choice to arrest us. And what I'd say here as well is that, yeah, you're right, the government's passed this law. But our position is this law is wrong. This law is completely bonkers. It makes no sense. I mean, Rod, do you really think I'm a terrorist? Do you really think the 500 people, pensioners there, are terrorists?
Okay, Paddy, let Rod reply.
No, I don't. No, I certainly don't. But at the same time, there are consequences. And I know you'll say, well, look, there are consequences that's happening in Gaza and everything else, and I empathise with your thoughts that way. But we're going to have a summer of discontent. We know what's going to happen. There's going to be demonstrations about the illegalism that's coming over. There's going to be demonstrations with your group. It's going to be quite volatile. And I just hope we can all sort of try and calm down a bit, and that includes, as you say, the police. Their hands are tied, and the law is the law, and they have to uphold it. they can't. They're not arbitrators. They just have to act. For them, it's a black and white case, and they're put in a pretty unenviable position. I speak from experience. It's a difficult one, and I hope that that they. I'm sure they're treated you with respect, and I respect your views. Don't necessarily agree with them, I have to say, but I just think that we have to be a bit careful here.
Yeah, Rod, just one second. I'll jump in there. But Paddy, Palestine Action said its goal was to overwhelm the police. Huda Amori, who co-founded the group, said the number of arrests was a farcical waste of police resources. But to overwhelm the police, is that really the motivation there?
It was not the motivation. Certainly not. Mm-hmm. The motivation was always to take a principled stance against an unjust law. And there's a long history in this country of civil disobedience and of doing just that. And that's how we've got many of the rights, we now take for granted today. This was never about overwhelming anything. This is about people coming together to uphold our basic democratic freedoms, our right to call out a genocide, to condemn our government's complicity in it, and to support those who resist it.
OK, let's speak to Katie Mcfadden now, Associate Solicitor at Hodge, Jones and Allen, who's been providing legal support to some of the people who were arrested yesterday. Good morning, Katie.
Hi, good morning.
Katie, can you just explain what it's been like for you then, representing the people who were arrested? Because the numbers are large, aren't they? If you look back, I think it was probably the poll tax in 1990 the last time. 339 were arrested. 306 arrested at an Extinction Rebellion protest in 2019. But how does the process work for you then, Katie, having to represent the people who were arrested on Saturday?
So it's certainly been quite busy. The way that the police decided to run this operationally was, as Paddy said, that they implemented a triage process. So they gave the vast majority of those who were arrested street bail. We think approximately 200 people were actually taken in police stations and they were processed there. Almost no one was interviewed by the police. They were simply detained in custody, often for very significant lengths of time, before given bail from the police station.
There were 6 arrests for assaults on officers as well, none seriously injured, I should add. 1 arrest for obstructing a constable in the execution of his or her duty, I think we said as well. The Attorney General, Lord Hammer, will be given the final say on whether or not prosecutions are brought. What will happen with the prosecutions, in your opinion, Katie? Will it be a fine or is there a potential prison sentence?
The offence for which the vast majority of people were arrested was one against Section 13 of the Terrorism Act, which is displaying an article in such a way as to arouse reasonable suspicion that someone is a member or a supporter of a prescribed organisation. That's what we call a summary-only offence, which means that it's one of the more minor criminal offences. It can only be tried in the magistrate's court and lead to a maximum sentence of 6 months imprisonment. I think realistically, and particularly when we look at the ages and the circumstances of the vast majority of the people, I would be very surprised if custodial terms were imposed. But again, it will depend on the approach that the courts seek to take. The vast majority, as you mentioned, of people who were arrested were over the age of, I think the average age was 54, wasn't it? Yeah. With over 100 people aged over 70. Now, these are people who have been upstanding members of society for all of their lives. We saw former British Army officers, former colonels being arrested. We have head teachers of schools. We've had Sir Jonathan Porritt, a former government advisor, who specifically stated that he's very concerned about the erosion of civil liberties which have taken place under successive governments. It certainly, I would suggest, beyond the pale for any of those individuals to be given custodial sentences. But the very importantly, they would have a conviction under the Terrorism Act, would have been deemed to be terrorists by the British state and British justice system. I think a very important thing is that they are not protesting in support of Palestine Action. They are protesting against the decision of the Home Secretary to prescribe Palestine Action and to deem them as terrorists simply for committing criminal damage.
Okay, well, just stay there for a second, Katie, because I'd like to ask Jonathan Turner here, Chief Executive Lawyer for Israel, to come on board. Jonathan, there's a conversation there, isn't it? Is it correct that PA should be prescribed at a terrorist organisation in the first place, in your opinion?
Well, in my view, they should. I think the prescription was right, and I hope it will be upheld by the courts. It is, of course, being considered in the courts, and we'll have to see what the result of that is. But I think the government's decision was right. They had caused massive damage to property. Some of their activities had involved, as I understand it, violent assaults on individuals as well, and certainly massive intimidation, including intimidation targeting Jewish organisations in a really rather racist way. And I think it is right to prescribe them. I do think that policing should be proportionate to the activity in question. You don't have to arrest everyone for every infraction of the law, and you don't have to impose bail conditions on them for every infraction of the law. I would myself advise the police to take a careful and proportionate view of different activities. I certainly do think, though, that the organisation of these completely unlawful activities of causing massive damage to property and engaging in activities that are liable to result in people being assaulted.
What about the protests on Saturday, though, Jonathan?
It's right to suppress that activity, and it's not suppressing freedom of speech. They have ample freedom of speech to express their views on the war in Gaza and the
But do they, though, Jonathan? Though, because they've all been arrested,
like
500 people arrested. Do they have the ability to express their views?
So I'm saying I think it could well be disproportionate to arrest everyone just because they have a placard that is obviously intended to take the mick rather than anything else. I think the better course might well be to reserve the powers of intervention by the police and the criminal system to the more serious acts of terrorism.
Okay, Jonathan.
That Palestine action is engaged in.
Okay, Jonathan, let's bring Brendan O'Neill in now, writer for Spiked and Spectator. Good morning, Brendan.
Hi.
Brendan, you've listened to Jonathan there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't agree with prescribing Palestine action. I think that's a bit too extreme. I think it's a bit illiberal. However, I agree with Jonathan that Palestine Action is a profoundly problematic organisation, and the way that, the middle-class left and journalists sing its praises as if it's some harmless group is completely wrong. And, when I saw all those people in Parliament Square yesterday this weekend holding up their signs saying, I support Palestine Action, I wanted to say to them, well, do you support what they did in Stamford Hill at the end of May? They went to Stamford Hill, which is a very famously a Jewish part of London. They smashed up a Jewish business. They smashed the front windows of it. They splashed red paint all over it, and some of that red paint went on actual Jewish symbols in that shop. And the residents who woke up the next day said they had terror struck into them, and it reminded them of the pogroms of the 1930s and the 1940s. And I'm old enough to remember when it was fascists who would smash up Jewish businesses. Now it's the so-called left. So I want to say to those people who say, I support Palestine Action, do you support that? Do you support that terrorization of our Jewish compatriots in London? And if you do, then I'm afraid you're not as progressive as you might like to think.
Okay, Brendan, just stay there with me for a second. Paddy, friend, is a spokesperson for Defend Our Juries. Paddy, what would you say to Brendan?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. This idea that Palestine Action are targeting Jewish organisations, that's a complete smear. What Palestine Action did is they targeted...
That's what the government have said, Paddy. That's what the government have said.
Well, that's a smear. It's not true.
It's what they did.
What Palestine Action did is they targeted Elbit Systems, who are Israel's largest arms manufacturer. And what Elbit Systems do is they make bombs and they make quadcopters that are raining down on people in Gaza right now and murdering them. And
what
that
did you do in
business in Stamford Hill, That
What
business
did you
in
do in
Stamford
Stamford
Hill
Hill?
was a landlord for Elbit Systems. It was
That's
a
not true.
landlord for Elbit Systems, and that's why
That
they
is
were
not true.
targeted.
That
Brendan.
is not true. The
It is
Jewish
true.
business that the people you're defending smashed up in a fascistic way completely denies that it has links with Elbit Systems. So you have to answer this. You are representing or speaking for an
Okay,
organisation that
right. We have
carried
to,
out.
Brendan. We have to just be careful on this as well. Actually, it's a sensitive subject, and we don't know the legalities of it in detail right now. But Paddy, again,
But one of the reasons we don't know the details is because very few people speak about what happened in Stamford Hill. It's just been forgotten. But you can read, even The Guardian covered it, and even The Guardian covered the business's denial that it has links with Elbit Systems, and it covered the reports of the residents who said that they felt terrorised by the smashing up of this Jewish business. So all I'm trying to say is, look, we can't just go around I don't think Palestine Action should be prescribed. I think that's too extreme. I also don't think it should be celebrated. And we do have to find a middle ground where we can allow people to express themselves freely, but we can also allow everyone else to say, listen, what you guys are doing is really bad.
Mm-hmm. Paddy.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I've heard credible reporting to the contrary. And let's make it very clear, that business was not targeted because it was a Jewish business.
Wait, Paddy, we just move away from that business. We can't talk about that in detail right now. But Paddy,
okay.
Brendan, coming back to you, the point you're making to Paddy is about that fine line, isn't it, between free speech and the ability to protest. Did you think it crossed the line on Saturday? Because from what Paddy said, it sounded like a peaceful protest.
I do think it crossed the line. I do. I don't agree with the arrests of those 50 people for holding up their signs. I mean, I do think you have to take some responsibility when you break the law. And I understand that sometimes people break the law to make a political point. People have been doing that for a very long time. But you do have to take the consequences of that. You do know that you're probably going to be arrested. But the thing is, we live in pretty authoritarian times. And over the past few years, we've had police knocking on the doors of gender-critical feminists. And we've had police arresting people for holding up supposedly offensive banners that are offensive to trans people or offensive to certain minorities. There have been waves of arrests of people for expressing their deeply held moral and political views. So what's happening to Palestine Action hasn't come out of the blue. And I think if the left had made a better fist of defending freedom of speech across the board, it might not find itself in the position it's now in.
Okay, but Paddy, just one thing I was going to put to you is that the placards read, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." Could you not have just said, "I oppose genocide" on those signs, and it would have saved a lot of trouble? Or is it deliberately trying to cause aggro for the police?
Well, look, the reason it said, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action, is because those two things are intimately linked. Palestine Action were taking action to try and stop a genocide. And of course, and then there's the other point, that this was an act of civil disobedience, ultimately. This was an act of 500 plus people. We think there were actually about 800 people there holding signs, and a few hundred walked
Israel,
away.
of course, deny the fact that it's a genocide. They say it's fighting a war of self-defense against Hamas, Paddy.
Well, about every other expert on international law says otherwise. And the scenes I'm seeing out of Gaza says otherwise as well. But sure, let's say that. Why not?
Well, Jonathan, coming back to you, Jonathan's Chief Exec Lawyer for Israel. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on what Paddy says there? Because again, we talk about that sign, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." Do you think if it had just said, "I oppose genocide," we'd even be having this conversation today?
Well, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The police would be allowing that to take place. Now, the claim that Israel is committing genocide is false, based on lots of false information, unfortunately, which has been rather disseminated in a widespread way. But it's completely untrue. But that's part of a debate that takes place in a democracy. But it doesn't justify people in trying to destroy the property, causing destruction of a considerable amount of property of perfectly lawful businesses and indeed British armed services. And may I also say regarding Elbit, it is a major supplier to the British armed forces, many other armed forces, and its products no doubt help Ukraine beat back the Russian forces that invaded Ukraine's territory. many people regard that as an entirely justified activity, and that obviously if you are going to defend a country like Ukraine against Russia, you do need arms supplies. Really, the truth is that help is being targeted because people hate Israel, which I think is a racist aspect of this campaign. But it's not actually justified. Unfortunately, it is sometimes necessary to fight against terrorism and aggressors. In this case, that's what Israel is trying to do. But all this is far away from the point about Palestine action itself.
Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to bring in Hayley in Nottingham, because Hayley, I believe you were at the protest. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
yes, I was at the protest.
How was the protest? What was the experience on Saturday like for you? Were you arrested?
I was arrested, yes. After sitting for almost an hour, surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of peaceful, brave, calm people of conscience who were just unable to sit back and watch a genocide happen and know that the government supposedly representing us
I have to say, it's
actively
not
participating.
Israel denies it's genocide. It's fighting, in their words, it's fighting a war of self-defense against Hamas. But Hayley, by holding that sign, I support Palestine action, you've heard why the government have prescribed them. Do you feel any differently having heard that from the Justice Minister this morning, Alex Davis-Jones?
I feel that the prescription is wrong, and I chose to sit and hold the sign to stand up against the prescription. I think it's a dangerous erosion of our civil liberties. There are more than ample laws available to charge and try and put through a fair trial any of the actions that Palestine action activists took. We don't need to abuse the Terrorism Act, because I think in doing so it dangerously waters down the use of the Act for genuine terrorists to align criminal damage.
Brendan, can I bring you back in there? Brendan's
a
right.
bomb.
Yeah, Brendan's a writer.
Completely unfair.
Okay, Hayley, let's bring Brendan back in. Brendan, would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I agree that it's overstepping the mark to prescribe Palestine action. I also agree that there are ample criminal laws that can be used against their activists who did break the law, and they knowingly broke the law when they carried out certain actions. And I believe in freedom of speech. I believe people should have the right to hold up signs saying, I support Palestine action. But, there are question marks over all of this, which I don't think we should tiptoe around. And I do think the animus for Israel that we're seeing coming mainly from the middle class sections of society, certainly from the left, certainly from the liberal establishment, it's disproportionate to anything I've ever seen in my life. And that does make me ask questions about what's driving this animus for Israel. I mean, for example, the Saudi-Yemen war, which is very recently, it was less than 10 years ago, that was a war also backed by the British government and the American government. That was a war whose consequences in Yemen were far more savage and disastrous and far greater famine than we're seeing in Gaza. And yet there wasn't this kind of response. There wasn't protests every weekend. It didn't suck up everyone's time on social media. It didn't become the focal point of the fury of those sections of society. So what is it about Israel that drives people so intensely mad? What is it about Israel that makes them take to the streets all the time? This is a question that we have to ask, and I've never heard a satisfactory answer for that.
Okay, Brendan O'Neill, thank you very much for your time, writer for Spiked and The Spectator. Appreciate that. We also spoke to Jonathan Turner, Chief Exec of UK Lawyers for Israel, and Paddy Friend, spokesperson for Defend Our Juries there as well. Just as a reminder, 532 people were arrested at a demonstration in London in support of banned group Palestine action. As yet, no one's been charged. Attorney General Lord Hermer will be given the final say, we believe, on whether or not prosecutions are brought. So what do you think? Were you there? Is it a peaceful protest? Or is it just support for a terrorist organisation? Free speech or hate speech? Please get in touch. 08285 909 693 or text us 85058. We would love to hear from you this morning.